People say I talk about some weird stuff, some far out stuff. But how about that chair that you're sitting in isn't solid? How weird is that? This reality is nothing like we think it is.
When I saw what Icke is doing, I was a bit jealous on him. Wow, look at what this guy's doing.
I don't know if anybody else could do it but him, actually.
We are in a period now where speaking your truth is not just important, it's utterly crucial to where humanity goes from here. The world needs renegades, and it needs them now. One of the big stories this week, and you know, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Why should an election for the Prime Minister of Israel be a big global story? The country is a tiny piece of land. They want it to be much bigger, but a tiny piece of land currently. And it is home to about 8 million people. Now, on that basis, there are elections going on around the world in small countries, which you basically never hear about. Well, a small country, it's not significant to the world, so we're not going to report it in Europe and America and all the rest. But this little piece of land, with its tiny population, is basically at the top of the news this week in the election, which Netanyahu, despite tying with his equally far-right opponent, in terms of the direct vote, will be Prime Minister for a record fifth time, because of the coalition parties he will be supported by, which significantly outnumber those that oppose him. And so why is it significant? Well, it's significant because Israel owns, and Netanyahu owns, Donald Trump. Those people that own Netanyahu own Donald Trump, which is basically the more accurate sequence. And this is blatantly obvious now. First of all, when it seemed that Netanyahu was going to be in trouble in this election, in the face of his opponent, a guy called Benny Gantz, who is a former military leader and just as far right as Netanyahu. Then Netanyahu's friends were very happy, often eager to help him. So in the middle of this election campaign, he goes off to Washington for a very public meeting with Donald Trump. Donald Trump announces that the Revolutionary Guards in Iran are to be designated a terrorist organization. And Netanyahu then brags that he did that because of a request from Netanyahu. Of course, we've had Trump trash the nuclear deal with Iran that calmed everything down, that this cabal that controls Israel, the United States, Britain, etc., France, Germany, doesn't want it calmed down with Iran. It wants regime change in Iran. And so Trump, on the say-so of people like Netanyahu and Trump's biggest funder, the ultra-Zionist Las Vegas casino magnate, Sheldon Adelson, they pressed, and of course, if they press, then Trump agrees, for the Iran nuclear deal to be trashed, and so Trump trashed it. And all that conflicts kicked off again. Netanyahu and Adelson and people around Trump, like his chief advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his bankruptcy lawyer, now the far-right extreme ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, were pressing him to move the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which has massive symbolic as well as literal implications for the Palestinians and their desire for a state of their own with part of Jerusalem as the capital. And more recently, he, again, to boost Netanyahu's election chances, because, of course, America doesn't interfere in elections, that's only Russia. He acknowledged Israeli ownership of the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land, much to the dismay of many around the world, many in the United Nations General Assembly. But I'm Trump. I'm a narcissistic purveyor of the stuff that comes out of the rear end of a bull. And therefore, I'll do it. And Trump made a speech in the last week or so at a Sheldon Adelson funded Jewish organization. It was in Las Vegas, as I recall, in which he said that he acknowledged, America's acknowledged that Israel now has a right to own the Golan Heights after what he called a quick history lesson given to him by Jared Kushner and David Friedman, which probably went something like, Donald, we own it, right? And he thought about it for 0.3 of a second. I said, yeah, I'll sign the papers. So that's how it came about. It was well thought out and given a lot of consideration. So all this was going on, and of course he was paraded in Washington, which means he was paraded on the Israeli media, all part of the let's get Netanyahu re-elected. And sadly, Vladimir Putin did the same. He agreed to meet Netanyahu in the latter stages of this election campaign, and he was paraded all over the Israeli media, having, as a world statesman meeting Vladimir Putin, a world statesman who is the prime minister of a tiny, tiny country of 8 million people, 20% of which are Arabs. And of course, if you cared about fair elections, then what you would say to Netanyahu when he's anchoring to come to meet you, whether you're Trump or Netanyahu, or Putin, you would say, no, if there's a good reason for you to come, then come after the election, because otherwise what you're doing is trying to use us to promote your re-election. And that's not right, that's not fair. But that's not, of course, never how politics works. And at least for one, possibly the both of them, Trump wouldn't dare turn him down. So I remember reading a book by a former Mossad agent in which, just as an aside, in what was a very long and detailed book about how Mossad works, the intelligence agency of Israel. And he said that the one thing basically you can be sure of about Israeli politics is it keeps moving to the right. And we've had this situation with this current election in which that's more obvious than ever before, because a far-right candidate in Netanyahu was being opposed by another far-right candidate, no matter what is claimed about him, this military bloke, Benny Gantz. And this coalition government now, which Netanyahu will lead, is a right-wing coalition, right-wing parties, and some of them are so far right they meet themselves coming back. So what chance have the Palestinians got in the face of this? Nothing. No chance. And as I've been saying for such a long time, this nonsense about a two-state solution, which is how people, not least of the so-called left, kind of end the conversation about Israel-Palestine. I believe in a two-state solution, and then they just change the subject because they don't want to face the fact that that is utter baloney. The two-state solution has been a non-starter for a long time now, and every day becomes more so. Why? Because the two-state requires land occupied by one group of people and not the other. So a two-state solution would be Israel being Israel before the rewriting of the 1967 borders, the West Bank, which has been occupied by Israel ever since, would be Palestinian land, which it legally is, and that, together with Gaza, would constitute some kind of Palestinian state. But what has happened, especially since Trump, because he's owned by the ultra-Zionists, owned by them. Oh, you can't say that? Well, I just have, and I'll keep saying it. You know why? Because it's true. And what's been happening is that Jewish-only settlements, not racist, of course. If you want to call Jewish-only settlements racist, then you're obviously an anti-Semite. The West Bank is being filled with Jewish-only settlements, all against international law. You're not supposed to settle countries that or land that you have acquired by war. But this country, this tiny country with its tiny population, is a law unto itself. Now, anyone might want to ask why that is, and they might get some very interesting answers. And so where we are then is the idea of a two-state solution has gone because there are not two states anymore. There's Israel, and then there's the West Bank, which is being occupied literally with more and more settlements by Israel. So where's the land for a second state? It's ridiculous. Oh, I believe in a two-state solution. Now let's talk about something else. Because if you ask me another question, I won't be able to answer you. And this is just going to go on now. In fact, where have we reached? We've reached the point where, after the pronouncement by Trump about recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli land, And by the way, there's an oil company involving Jacob Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch, and a stream of other elite names that is drilling for oil in the Golan Heights. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. And we've now seen the moment that Trump agreed the Golan Heights pronouncement, that Netanyahu was saying, yeah, and we're going to annex the West Bank next. Well, some of us have been saying that for decades, because this has been the game all along. You impose Israel upon Palestine by untold, sickening violence. I mean, just if you want to see the background to psychopathic violence, then just do some reading about the how Israel came about and why about 750,000 Palestinians in the period around 1948 just fled the country they were born in, and their families and ancestors were born in, and are still in, and their successors are still in refugee camps in places like Jordan. Financial support for which is being now deleted by Trump on the say-so of the same people. And the idea all along was that Palestinians would basically be removed from the country, removed from the land, because Israel has a plan for what is known as the Greater Israel, which takes parts of Syria, Lebanon in totality, and Iraq, etc. And the whole period since, which has become known laughably and ludicrously as the peace process, has been nothing more than a holding position, buying time to ensure that there are so many Jewish-only settlements in the occupied land that it becomes irreversible, which is where we are now. And the idea was never to find peace. And in this way, groups like Hamas, which if you chart it back, was supported into existence by Israel, who wanted another organization to divide and rule the Palestinians and challenge the then Palestinian, if you like, leadership group known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, run by a guy called Yasser Arafat. And Hamas is, I'm not saying every person who calls himself Hamas, because most of them in this compartmentalized structure will have no clue what Hamas is really being used for. But Hamas has been the constant excuse by the far-right, psychopathic, extremist Israeli government to blow the peace process. Anytime it's coming to a point where some kind of agreement might be on the table, suddenly there's an Hamas excuse by Israel to pull out. And of course, Hamas has been the justification in Israel's propaganda for the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza, with state-of-the-art bombardments on a basically defenseless people. But again, don't you dare criticize them for doing that, or you're an anti-Semite, which of course is the industry and the protection racket, protecting not Jewish people, but protecting the Israeli psychopaths in government from legitimate exposure and questioning. So we are now watching the end game in all this, and it's planned to be what Trump proclaims as the deal of the century, to bring about peace between Israel and Palestinians. And it is quite right, the deal of the century for Israel. The plan is this: to so subjugate Palestinians, to let them see by these constant new settlements that any hopes of a state of their own are gone, and to push them into ever greater economic deprivation. This is what all the cutbacks by Trump, i.e. by Netanyahu and Adelson, all these cutbacks of aid to Palestinians and Palestinian refugees from the great fleeing from terror exodus that I talked about, to put them in such deprivation with clearly no prospect of a state of their own, because the land on which that state was supposed to be is now occupied by Jewish-only settlements, that they'll come out and offer some money and some irrelevant, quote, concessions, and force the Palestinians into agreeing. That's the plan. That's what the deal of the century is planned to be. You watch. And Israel will then annex and absorb the West Bank, and it will be what has already been passed into law by the Netanyahu psychopathic government and so many others in other parties equally psychopathic, which is that Israel is a Jewish state, not an Israeli state of many different groups, a Jewish state. That's now law, the nation state law. And that's what it will be. And any Palestinians who continue to live in that Israel will be absolutely second-class citizens, not even citizens in truth, in what will be the most blatantly apartheid, racist country on earth. It is now, but this will be official then. So that's what all this is about. And although Benny Gantz would have gone down the same bloody road, they really wanted Netanyahu to stay in place because of continuity of this story. And that's where we are. And it's absolutely, utterly disgusting.
The world needs renegades, and it needs them now.